The Prime Minister was asked about MP safety today, asked to react to the Sergeant-at-Arms who says the harassment of MPs has jumped, up 700 to 800% in the last 5 years. It's why he is recommending MPs to keep their doors locked and to be extra cautious when they meet their constituents. Take a listen now to what Justin Trudeau had to say about the situation.
Atmosphere of polarization, of toxicity, of misinformation, of disinformation, of anger directed at individuals and institutions is not a healthy trend line for democracy in Canada or everywhere around the world where we are increasingly seeing it. Individual hatreds and acts of violence aimed at people who are serving their communities, who put themselves forward to serve their communities in any order of government, that's unacceptable, and it's something that all Canadians need to be mindful of and aware of as we reflect on what kind of country we are and what kind of country we want to be for the future.
Well, with that, let's bring in our weekly political panel. Carlene Variyan is a former Chief of Staff to Liberal Cabinet Ministers, now an Associate Vice President at Summa Strategies. Mitch Heimpel is a former Chief of Staff to an Ontario PC Minister, and now the Director of Policy at Enterprise Canada. And here in studio, Anne McGrath, Principal Secretary to the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. Hello to the three of you.
Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Hello. Listen, and I'm going to start with you because really in a lot of ways this picks up on the conversation that we were having last week about what MPs are facing when they go out there into the world these days. But you know what really struck me was the number, and to be fair, it's anecdotal because you know the Sergeant-at-Arms is saying he believes it's somewhere between 700 to 800% of an increase. But how shocking is that number? Does that surprise you in any way?
Well, I will say that it doesn't surprise me, but it's interesting because last week we were talking about particular instances that had happened, but certainly I've been hearing about it from many of our MPs, but also other MPs from other parties as well. I think that you can't work in politics and not see this all the time, and you know it's maybe a bit innocent or whatever, but one of the things I've always appreciated about Parliament and politics in this country is that you could see a cabinet minister walking down the street by themselves sometimes. You could MPs felt very comfortable going to community events, walking down the street, going to the grocery store, all of those kinds of things. It's not exactly like that anymore. It's not like it's happening every minute of every day, but the evidence is mounting that this is a serious problem. And I think that the recommendations also pose a very serious problem for our democracy and for people's capacity to access their elected representatives. Yeah, and this applies to staff as well, I will say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will pick up on that point. But I'll bring in you, both Carlene and Mitch, on this, beginning with you, Carlene. Does that number surprise you, a huge number?
It doesn't. I think, well, actually, we've been hearing from our security and intelligence officials for years now that radicalization to threats of violence and radicalization all the way to actual acts of violence has been on the rise in this country for quite some time. It's usually grievance fueled. It's usually related to groups of people that feel marginalized or isolated. It's happening to our politicians, but it's also happening in other sectors too. I mean, think of the last few years where we've seen healthcare workers harassed on their way into work at a hospital or a clinic. Think of today where we had for the third time shots fired at a Jewish day school in Montreal. This level of radicalization that is leading to threats and to actual violence to not just our public officials, but other people in our society is really concerning. But I'd have to agree with Anne. I'm unfortunately not surprised to see these numbers related to our members of parliament.
Yeah, Mitch, what do you say to it?
It's also unfortunately not limited to Canada. We've seen examples, I think, two recently from the United Kingdom where members of both the Labour and the Conservative parties have been attacked by constituents or voters in recent years. And that suggests that the trend lines we're seeing in Canada are just an exasperation of things we're seeing internationally. I'm inclined to agree with both of my colleagues that this isn't limited to politics. The example that Carlene just gave about the incidents at Jewish day schools in both Toronto and Montreal in recent days give us significant reason for concern. It is definitely going to be a long-term issue that the parliamentarians better be prepared to deal with in the near future. And I don't know what the necessary immediate tools are going to be at hand for them to do that. But if it involves taking parliamentarians out of the community or making them more hesitant to go to community events, that's a bad thing for democracy.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on that point, though, Mitch, because, part of the recommendation here from the Sergeant at Arms, and this was in that email that went out earlier in the month, where he advised MPs, once again, to keep their doors locked. And this is on the Hill, right, to keep your doors locked and to be very cautious about meeting constituents face to face. You talk about democratic impacts, Anne. What impact are you most worried about here?
Well, I think the impact I'm worried about is that it removes members of parliament from their constituents and from voters, and it reduces the access of voters to their elected representatives. And citizens need to be able to interact with their members of parliament, whether it's on immigration issues, on passport issues, on there's so many things that a member of parliament has to be able to interact with their constituents about, and you can't we are all, getting better at, electronic things and, not doing things face to face. But there does need to be the capacity to have face-to-face interaction with your member of parliament. I believe I believe that particular recommendation really gave me a chill.
Yeah, well, to that point, it's always amazing because of the role I get to play. I meet politicians face to face, and the impressions I have is so often different because I am meeting them face to face than people out in the rest of the country. Carlene, I'll get you to add on to that. Talk about the democratic impacts that you're worried about with this situation.
I'm worried about how we are ever going to expect to be able to attract a high caliber of people to put their names on ballots and to want to serve their communities at municipal or provincial or federal levels of government when this is what they can expect. Certainly, as we head into another federal election at some point in the next 12 to 18 months, I know certainly it's a conversation that a lot of liberals in my corner are having, and that I'm sure to a certain extent people from all political parties are having, is how are we going to persuade people who share our vision of the country to want to put their name forward to run for office when all that we can offer them is possibly, 4 years of a life where you're regularly having to look over your shoulder when you're walking around in your community, or have your office vandalized, or not feel safe, not have your family feel safe. I think that the impacts, the chill on being able to attract people to serve and recruit people to participate in the democratic process is really concerning.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, what's your take on it?
I think if we view this as just politicians trying to interact through their official capacity, locking the doors in their constituency or on their Hill office, we miss the point of their broader job. We've seen incidents where I believe Melanie Joly was accosted on the street in the city of Montreal. There's obviously the famous incident of the finance minister being accosted in a venue in Edmonton, I believe, a number of years ago. Michelle Rempel-Garner had to file for, I think, a protective order against somebody who had been harassing her. So this gets into an interesting category when you start talking about things like election campaigns, where our members of parliament and candidates have to go door to door. There are a number of scenarios I think we haven't fully considered when we talk about this degree of harassment and violent rhetoric as it pertains to our MPs.
Okay, I'm going to stay with you, Mitch, because you said you weren't entirely certain how it might be addressed, but I will put you on the spot because, when we have this conversation, people do want some type of remedy. People do want to find some type of path out of this, and I appreciate that it's not an easy question to answer, but when you consider that, Mitch, what do you think might be a remedy here?
Wow, you really did put me on the spot there. I
hope you come back.
I think we have options in terms of how we engage with people on social media. That's a big thing. Too often, and we have some members of parliament who do this as a matter of profession. We tone up the rhetoric on social media instead of turning the volume down, and no party's particularly innocent on that score. And that's certainly not helpful. I think we could start there. I think, I don't have there is no silver bullet to how we do this. I think it's going to be 10,000 little measures instead of one particular policy fix.
Mm-hmm. Carlene?
Well, it doesn't help when members of the political class sort of participate in the type of tone and interaction that sets an example that fuels that sort of race to the bottom in terms of the level of discourse and dialogue either. Certainly here in Ottawa, we're into what we call silly season right now, that final stretch of sittings of the House before everybody leaves for summer. And every year it's a bit of a tense time because MPs have had a long year. There's a push to get bunch of legislation through and tensions are high, but I do think that we've all seen that the level of debate in the House has been a bit lower for the last number of weeks as well, and that the tone and approach that some of our politicians are taking, and it applies to all parties, is maybe not where it should be either. So I think the tone does need to start at the top, and Mitch sort of alluded to that. But again, to just take a bit of a broader view here of the type of causes of that radicalization that leads people to make threats or to attack a public official in public, or to actually move to violence. There's a ton of research that's done in the academic world and has been done for a long time about things that can prevent that. And so far, nobody's figured out what the magic bullet is, pardon the expression, that can help. But what a lot of the conclusions are is that isolation of communities certainly doesn't help, that trying to bring a broader diversity of perspectives into any issue, whatever the form, and that would certainly include politics, can help to ensure that people who feel more distant from centers of decision-making, like Parliament Hill in Ottawa, are more included. Those types of things can help. But I'm talking about very pie in the sky ideas right now in terms of, what could we do in the next month, in the next year? It's, I think, as Mitch said, going to be a lot of little things, and I do think the tone has to start at the top.
Anne?
Yeah, I'd agree that there's no magic solution to this, but I think there are some policy things that could address some of it. And we talked a little bit about some of these last week. But I'm a big believer in some form of electoral reform to introduce some level of proportionality into our electoral system, and also public financing of political parties, because I do believe that the imperative for political parties to fundraise primarily through social media these days and through digital, it creates the desire to whip up people's emotions, and I think that's very, very damaging, I think, to our political discourse. So I think public financing of political parties would go a long way.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that is as much time as we have for today, but really appreciate the conversation. Obviously, an important one given the type of figures that were shared here by the Sergeant at Arms. So Anne, Carlene, Mitch, thank you for the time this evening.
Thank you.